Let's look at the vegetation bottom type. In this chapter, we're going to cover the information for both AutoChart Live and AutoChart Pro. They are identical in functionality, however there are a few subtle differences in the presentation of the menus. We'll conduct our training with AutoChart Pro because it's easier for me to make changes and show the results of those changes. When you look at an area that you've recorded, you see various depths. As you can see, a point is coming off here. This is a hump area, and there's an extreme drop-off right here going into deeper water still yet. And the vegetation is not going to grow in 50 feet of water normally. It's going to grow in the shallow areas. And when you first go into your vegetation view, the default indicates some areas where the vegetation should be, but it also shows a lot of areas that are green. We're going to show you how to change these parameters and give you information that is more meaningful to help you pick out where the vegetation is going to be. We're using a palette that shows at 0 a dark green, and our end range here is at 58, which shows a very light green. This range can be varied, and we'll show you an example of that a little later on. We have a transparency slider bar on the right side, and this corresponds to the transparency range on your AutoChart Live menu. 0 means there is no transparency. In other words, it overrides everything. As you go down to 10, 20, 30%, it lets that much more information show through. Well, how do I really know this is vegetation? Well, I'm going to show you some waypoints that I've put on here. And this shows the beginning of some hydrilla, and this shows the ending point of that hydrilla. It was growing along this line. So now I'm going to bring up another application called Hum Viewer. We have training on this in a separate course, but I'm going to play it. We're coming up, slowly coming up, and we've hit the edge of the hydrilla right here. You can see it sticking up on the down image view. You can see it clearly on the 2D view and the side image view. So I put a waypoint right there where it started. I'm going to hit play, speed it up a little bit. And we're going down that line now. And we continue to see the hydrilla, and we're right at the edge of it. Now we're coming to the end of it, and I put a waypoint at the stop point. And these correspond with the beginning and ending. If we look at a side image mosaic, we can see that same area, and we can see the hydrilla outline coming through here. I'll go in a little bit on it. So it did indeed show us the hydrilla in the highlighted areas. We're now going to look at an example where the vegetation is very heavy. I'm going to go in and change my graph at the bottom, and I'm going to say the max vegetation is 30. Let's see what that does to our graph. It shows a little more intensity. And once again, I'm going to go into the Hum Viewer application, and I'm going to show you that same area as we make a pass over it. I'm going to slow down the speed a little bit and play it. As you can see, this is pretty heavy hydrilla that we're going over, and it goes a good long way. Back in AutoChart, you can see the heavier area, and then as you drop off in contours, it gets a little less dense, or it appears to show a little less dense. But that's a pretty good example of very heavy vegetation, and you couldn't probably run a crankbait through this stuff. It's that heavy. We have a side image overlay of that same recording, and you can see the hydrilla that's very thick in here. There are a couple of areas where it seems to be missing. If you'll remember, we saw that on our green chart a minute ago, our vegetation chart, and then down through here it seems to be missing. We're back in our Hum Viewer application looking at another recording. Notice all the hydrilla on both sides of the recording. What would you expect your AutoChart Live vegetation map to look like? Well, this is it. That doesn't give you much information at all, does it? And there's a reason why. If you'll remember our best practices, we should use a zigzag pattern. This recording was just a straight line, and it showed the hydrilla 30 to 40 feet away from the transducer. So I think the system had a hard time figuring out what this was out here. If we did a zigzag pattern going back and forth and across this, it would pick up this hydrilla and it would make a better map. And if you looked at this in AutoChart Live, you would think there's no hydrilla here. To use the vegetation function, make sure that the bottom layer shows visible and that the bottom type is vegetation. Vegetation transparency goes on a scale from 0 to 100. If it's set to 0, then the vegetation screen overrides everything else. As you progress down towards 100, less and less shows. It corresponds to the slider bar on the right of the AutoChart PC version. This would be 0, bring it down, bring it down, bring it down, bring it down, somewhere around 50. Continue to go down, 60, 70, and when you get down, you're at 100, so that means that it's totally transparent. Everything else comes through. Next, we'll go down to the Vegetation Options submenu. This functionality is very important, and it's key to making maps that are very effective for you to look at the lake and find out where your vegetation is. You have a slider bar that you can go from 0 to a desired level for the min and for the max vegetation. Once again, however, we're going to go to our AutoChart PC software because it's much easier for me to change this and show you the results. So let's do that now. The first thing we want to do is look at the minimum vegetation setting. As the system is building the vegetation map, if it calculates a value that is less than the min, it will not show up. So if I change it to 10, that means anything that has a value, a hardness, or a vegetation level less than 10 won't show up. So I'll click OK. And it has changed the graph significantly. You can see that areas where it dropped off, and when we looked at the side image information and the 2D information, it did not show any grass or hydrilla. You can see that here. And if I zoom in a little bit better. Now let me change the max hardness. I'm going to take that down to 30. Let's see what that does. Okay, that made it even better, and it really highlights the areas that had the hydrilla. There were a couple of areas where there was like a high spot and there wasn't any grass growing on it, so this showed it pretty much exactly the way we saw it on the graph. So you can toggle with these and see if you can find values that make more sense to you. Let's just play with it a little bit, change that to 5 and see what that looks like. It probably gave me some more areas of hydrilla. Let's change it again. Let's go to 15 and see what that does. That reduced my area even further. So I'm going to put it back to 10, and just for grins, I'm going to put this to 20 and see what that does. Okay, that probably showed me too much area where it thinks there is vegetation, because that's not what we saw when we looked at the HumViewer information. So if I go back to 30, that's probably the most realistic of any of the settings that will match what we saw in HumViewer. As with the chart and bottom hardness, you have many choices for the palette you use for your vegetation colors. We have selected palette number 1, and I believe it goes through palette 7. The gain offset is an adjustment to your sensitivity. There's a way to calculate this that is in the Hummingbird instructions. I'm going to show you how to do that in AutoChart Pro. To create this value in AutoChart Live, you're going to need to use the min and max vegetation numbers that you have set up for this calculation. What this really does, it's a sensitivity setting, and it's based on the minimum and the maximum, either hardness or vegetation, that it finds in the lake. The current minimum and maximum are in the legend in the lower left-hand corner of the display. Here's what we want to do. We want to create the map, and when it does that, it's going to create it with the values of 0 to 100 being the deepest. Okay, now I want to click on this button that shows me the depth range. So it's going to go through my recordings, not the depth range that was arbitrarily set before, but it's actually looking at the files that have been processed. And I click this button, and what it's done now is it's adjusted that from 0 to 62 feet. So now I come back into the settings, and now what I want to do is I want to divide 100 divided by the max here. I have 62 feet, so I'm going to type in 62. That's going to give me 1.61. So now I'm going to come over to my gain and type in 1.61. For AutoChart Live, you would take the max vegetation number of 100 and divide that by 100, which would give you 1, and that's what you would use as your gain. The default value is set to -7 in the Helix unit, and the AutoChart Pro unit will not let you have a negative or 0 number. Remember that vegetation can change from season to season and year to year. If you're looking at recordings you made last year, you might want to double check and make sure that vegetation is still there.